I think story just transcends format. Like, I think you can tell your brand story, you can tell your personal story, you can tell the story through video, you can tell a story through article. And I think when you can tell a good story, it doesn't matter how you tell it, it matters that it was told.
What constitutes a good story? How do you begin the process of telling a good story? In the outdoor industry, the word story gets thrown around a lot. And in my opinion, I don't know that it's an accurate use of the word 90% of the time. From my perspective, a good story does two things. Number one, it's a communication vessel. And number two, it has to leave an emotional response with your intended audience. Think back to all the times you've been in a marketing meeting and the word story gets brought up. If you think about the end deliverables, the end products that were created, how many of them actually left your audience with an emotional response? If it didn't, I'd question whether the story being told was told well. In this upcoming 4-part series, we're going to dive into the process of how to tell good stories. We're going to talk about the elements of a story. We're going to talk about how to better understand your audience in order to tell a story that they'll resonate with, that they'll enjoy. We're going to talk about how to develop insights and using informed observations and insights to help tell powerful and meaningful stories for your intended audience. And lastly, once you have the vision for your story, we're going to talk about how do you communicate that to a creative team? How do you bring on partners and team members in order to execute on this vision? So if you're interested, if you want to geek out about stories, you'll definitely want to tune in to these next 4 episodes. We've got some amazing industry veterans coming onto the show to share their expertise, to share their insight. This episode you're listening to right now is number 1 of 4. I hope you stick around and enjoy this episode. Welcome to the Backcountry Marketing Podcast. My name is Cole Heilborn. Today, I'm sitting down with Roo Smith. He's a documentary adventure filmmaker. Roo, how are you?
Hey, Cole, how's it going? Thanks so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to chatting today.
Yeah, absolutely. How is your day going?
Day's awesome. I'm actually in your neck of the woods. I'm up in Washington. My niece is out here and is like 1.5, so I took her to the zoo yesterday, which was wildly fun. We looked at some penguins. It was pretty crazy. Changing all the big adventures to the mini adventures with the niece.
Nice. Are you in the Seattle area or are you back out on Orcas?
Yeah, we're in the Seattle area. I kind of wish I was on Orcas, but my sister lives out in Kirkland, so we're chilling in Kirkland.
Cool. Well, Roo, as you know, we are kicking off a 4-part series. We're talking all about the creative process, how to tell great stories. And I'm excited to have you on the show today because you're going to kind of set the table for us. Storytelling is something that I know you and I personally geek out about. It's also something that I feel like our industry loves. We love to talk about stories. We love to talk about telling stories. And this series is all about trying to help folks understand the process that they can go through to take an idea and ultimately develop it into a really solid story that also accomplishes the goals that the brand or the agency might have. But we wanted to start this detailed kind of technical conversation kind of talking about the romantic view of storytelling. And you as a documentary filmmaker have told some amazing stories. You have a deep understanding of the storytelling process and the beauty that comes along with it and the power of storytelling. And so we're going to be talking all about that today. I'd love if you could, before we go there, kind of back up, give us a little background on who you are, what you do, and some of the projects you've worked on.
Yeah, I love it. No, I feel like exactly what you said, like the romantic side of storytelling. Like, this is it, you know? And I think it even starts with like how you introduce yourself, right? It's like, okay, hey, I'm Roo. This is the story I'm going to tell you about myself, which, like, you know, we'll get into more of like why that's important for brands to do down the line for sure. But yeah, so I'm Roo. I am named after the Winnie the Pooh character. I have 3 older sisters and they loved Winnie the Pooh when I was born. And so started out as Lil Roo, and then similar to like Lil Bow Wow, kind of dropped the Lil and just became Bow Wow. I just became Roo. So yeah, I grew up on Orcas Island, which is this awesome little island off the coast of Washington State. Kind of moved around a little bit. I lived in Costa Rica for a little while, lived in Wales for a little while, and then eventually moved out to Colorado, where I'm at now. I live in Boulder, right at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, which is beautiful and stunning. Got into filmmaking kind of late high school, started making surf videos with my friends on some GoPros, and they were terrible, but I loved it. I had so much fun. I like got a copy of like iMovie or Final Cut Pro or something and was like loving the editing process, loving the filming process, and I ended up getting an internship at Colorado College, where I went to school, working as a video intern for the communications department, making videos for the school. And kind of fell in love with storytelling there. I had a really great mentor who, Rachel San Luis, she's an amazing storyteller, an amazing documentary filmmaker, and would kind of make these videos about the school in a documentary format. So we would take the like political science building and take a student or a professor and make like a mini documentary about them to kind of promote what the political science department was doing. So I feel like it was then that I really started to understand like, whoa, this is kind of the ins and outs of stories. This is why they're important. This is how they can be used in a marketing way. And kind of my sophomore year of college, started freelancing on the side of class and would just kind of go out and make all these passion projects and do all of these adventure projects while pursuing a degree in political science. I really wanted to be a diplomat, and I spent every summer working at the State Department, working in foreign policy, and eventually realized that world wasn't quite right for me. But after all those years of traveling internationally and studying Spanish, and I studied Arabic for a long time, that it wasn't a good fit. So kind of switched, started to pursue video full time, and that was, I guess, 4 or 5 years ago, and haven't really looked back.
Wow. In college, sounds like you were running a makeshift production company out of your dorm room, filming a bunch of weddings. So is that how you were paying the bills?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think paying the bills is, as a college student, the bills are pretty low, so I didn't have to make too much money, thankfully. I started doing these like adventure weddings when I was like a sophomore in college, and it was basically just like glorified hiking videos. As I would go out and it would just be me and the couple. In Colorado, you can do what's called like self-solemnize, which you can marry yourself, so you don't need an officiant. So I would just go out and like film and photograph these couples that would be like, we want to go hiking or we want to go skiing and get married at the top of the mountain. And I'm like, that sounds awesome. Like way better than like going into a stuffy church building for me on a Saturday afternoon, the lifestyle I really enjoyed, and did that for, a couple of years part-time, like during school. Really the passion was like, I want to do outdoor adventure videos, and I want to tell like meaningful, uplifting stories about like hope, joy, and adventure in the outdoor space. So weddings and the adventure weddings, like that was just a means to allow myself to do that and pursue those on the side.
Yeah. Sounds like you've since stopped filming weddings, and now you've really taken a hard pivot the last few years, just working on some incredible adventure projects. I know you just had one film at a festival. Can you share a little bit about what that was like?
Totally. Yeah. I think the adventure documentary space is a really exciting space to be a part of. So recently I was invited to present my film at the Boulder International Film Festival and a number of other film festivals, but the Boulder International Film Festival was like hometown local. So I just got to walk down the street from my house and go present in front of a few hundred people and talk about this film. It was about this skier named Kevin Wilson, who like 30 years after becoming paralyzed in a car accident, kind of found his love for skiing again. He kind of overcame alcoholism and obesity, and is now teaching other people with disabilities how to ski and is living the dream. So we presented that film, and it was really nice to see all the local community come out and support Kevin and support Ignite Adaptive Sports, the nonprofit that we are helping promote. So it was really meaningful. And I think for me, storytelling is so much about sharing other people's stories through film. And Kevin had a really amazing story, and their nonprofit's doing really amazing work. And so kind of removing myself. And it's always great when the Q&A happens and people aren't like, how did you film this on the gimbal? They're like, what was the pre-production process like? But all of the questions are directed towards the subject. I think that's when it was a successful project. So it was really nice to step away and have Kevin take the spotlight.
We were chatting earlier, you were sharing with me kind of like your personal manifesto in a way. And let me know if I butcher this, but it's something like adventure is my passion, but storytelling is my purpose. Is that right?
Totally. Yeah. Outdoor adventure is my passion. Storytelling is my purpose.
And so that kind of informs everything that you do, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I always like to take it one step farther, because I think the outdoors is a really amazing kind of backdrop and stage for a lot of this stuff. And so I say like outdoor adventure is my passion, storytelling is my purpose, and I do that by sharing uplifting stories about hope, joy, and adventure. Those are kind of like the criteria that I aim to hit with every project.
Very cool. So let's wind the clock back a little bit. When did you first become interested in the idea of a story? Were you always a kid who loved, campfires and telling stories with your family or friends, or like walk me through kind of Roo as a kid?
Yeah. Oh man. Roo as a kid, not much different than Roo as an adult. Smile all the time. Just loved, being with people. I'm definitely like an extroverted person. And for me, I think it all began with songwriting. I minored in music in college, but I was given a guitar when I was 13 and started writing songs, really cheesy songs about girls that I had crushes on in middle school and high school. But I think I started to take a critical eye at a lot of songs that I really loved, and I was like, wow, like Karma Chameleon, like why do I enjoy that song, you know? Or like all these other Ed Sheeran pieces that I'm like, wow, that was beautiful. Like why does that resonate with me so deeply? And so looking at songs first as a form of storytelling was kind of where it all began. And I think from there, I've always enjoyed magazines and movies and TV shows. Like How I Met Your Mother is one of my favorite TV shows. And I think the storytelling that they do in that show is amazing because they take this like same format. It's like friends hanging out in a bar, and they take it all sorts of directions, and you're crying and you're laughing and you're like empathizing with the main character. And I think that's like when things really start to hit to me. Like I think that's when things really began to take form for me as something that I was like, whoa, I think this can have impact. And kind of like I said with the diplomacy thing, the reason I was chasing that career is I think that was a way that I could have impact in my life through my work. And now I realize that you can have impact in all aspects of your life, whether it be through work or not through work. But I think for me, storytelling was a way that I actually felt I could have a way bigger impact in my life.
I love that you were asking the question, why do I feel this way? And so you started to try to dissect the particular song. So that kind of leads me to my next question is like, yeah, for you, when how do you define a story? Like when you're seeking to make a story, how do you know when you have successfully like use that word in the medium that you've created? Because I feel like the word story gets thrown around all the time and it can mean very different things for different people. I'm curious what your interpretation of it is.
Yeah, I think for me, I think story just transcends format. Like I think you can tell your brand story, you can tell your personal story, you can tell the story through video, you can tell a story through article. And I think for me, as somebody that consumes, I feel like magazines and songs and TV shows, and you know, I make outdoor adventure videos, but I love just listening to stories through songs. I think when you can tell a good story, it doesn't matter how you tell it, it matters that it was told. And I think that's when I feel like I can really nail it. Like ideally, I can make a video, write a song, write an accompanying article, and share one photo, and it would capture that story. And I think that's like similar to that Paralyzed ski film. I think that is a story that you could tell in a wide range of formats, and that's when I felt like I hit like, okay, this is something worth pursuing in a video format for sure.
So what about a story allows it to transcend medium? What are kind of the nuts and bolts that make it possible to do that?
There's so many ways to tell stories. I think one structure that I really resonate with is somebody wants something and they have to overcome something to get it. And so having a clear beginning, middle, and end, also known as like the exposition, the challenge, and the resolution, kind of this like 3-act structure, can really kind of set the stage. I always think of stories too, like especially with plays. I think plays do it really well when they just like have like a who, what, when, where, why, what's happening in the first act, you know, like boom, we're on stage, this is where we are, this is what we're doing. And I think as the outdoor adventure filmmaker in me, like the outdoors is just always the stage. It's always the backdrop. But I think you're challenging yourself to push it one step farther and say, okay, here's the stage, but this isn't the plot, you know? You have the amazing mountains or you have this challenging wave, but that's just one section of the story. That's the where, but you still need the who and the what and the why, and the when, I guess. But I think creating it one step farther and having like going deeper into the emotions, I think the emotion part of it is really like where things hit for me. Like I always think of storytelling in like the 5 types of storytelling. There's like those that inspire, there's those that persuade, there's those that launch like movements like the Martin Luther Kings of the world that are amazing storytellers. I think stories that can tap into your potential, and those that manipulate. And I think all types of those stories, they all serve, you know, a way to communicate emotion to people. And I think going back even farther, like with this age of data and paid ads and how do we get an audience involved, I think allowing people to feel something is ultimately like where it all comes down to and where it all matters. Is with storytelling and the way that it's been for millennia it makes us feel something. And that's why I think we continue to do it, is you have somebody who wants something, has to overcome something to get it. But it's that feeling that we're left with, and that inspiration, or that, like, I don't know, that revolution, or we're tapping into potential, or we're manipulated and we're anxious. Like, all of those emotions have a place. And I think when you are successful and you can tap into that, sure, there's the 3X structure and there's like all of these technical little details that you can go into. But I think taking the 30,000 foot view of, we tell stories and stories matter because emotions matter and feelings matter, and letting your audience feel something and letting ourselves feel something, that matters too. And I think, kind of going back to the initial part of like, where does storytelling begin for you? I think I feel that way because I would listen to these Ed Sheeran songs. I'm like, why do I feel this way? This is amazing, you know? Or, I mean, Taylor Swift, same thing. My older sister loved Taylor Swift. And I was like, why does she feel that way? And then you kind of look at her lyrics and you're like, well, that was a really beautiful story, you know? She took Romeo and Juliet and made it into a love story. And it was a classic song that we still listen to now. And we're like, dang, that's amazing, you know? And I think when you're allowing others to feel something, you can have that story be retold. And I think the most successful stories are the ones that get retold again and again. And I think, sorry if I'm rambling, feel free to cut me off. But good. I think going back even farther, like, to look at storytelling through history, it starts like as an oral history, right? It's like you have the caveman like drawing on the walls and telling stories that way, passing it down. Then you have like the printing press, and then photographs and radio, and then video. And now video seems to be the format that we're consuming the most. But I think if you look at anybody who's successful from a name recognition standpoint, they're all like great storytellers. And I was thinking about this recently because I like volunteer at my church, and I work with like the 4th and 5th graders, and they are 4th and 5th graders. So they're like super rowdy and they go all over the place and they're bouncing off the walls. And I feel like the second I sit down and start to tell a story to them, like about Jesus or about myself, just like, this is my process on like learning about friendship as an adult. Like, they sit down and they listen. And I've been trying to dissect like why stories matter so much for kids, but I think it's that emotion. They can be transported into another world, and like their endless amounts of energy isn't, you know, what's preventing them from focusing. They have something else to focus on. And I think, like, regardless of what your, you know, perceptions of Christianity are, I think Jesus, like, from what it lays out in the Bible, like, that dude could capture a crowd. Like, he was a storyteller, right? And I think when you take it all the way back from like the oral history, it's like, it doesn't all start with Jesus, but I think Jesus is like one of the first documented storytellers that I think was doing it in a really compelling way. And right, like, you fast forward and you have like the radio and all these radio hosts, you have like the printing press, like Alexander Hamilton writing a ton, Benjamin Franklin. Like, one of my favorite stories about Benjamin Franklin is like when he was 14, he was rejected a ton from the printing press, and he wrote these silence do good letters, like kind of fronting as this like old elderly woman, and would write about like freedom of speech and freedom of press, and would get his ideas out there because he was, you know, 14 and nobody wanted to listen to him. But still, like, the printing press was a way for him to do that and to tell those stories and to get people inspired and persuade and launch movements and tap into people's potential. And I think like storytelling, like I said, like when it transcends format like that, like you can have photos of the JFK assassination, like sharing news and world events, and it's transpiring in faraway places, but we're still able to receive it today. Like, photos were telling stories. Then you have like FDR and his fireside chats, sharing it on the radio, just talking about the Great Depression or whatever it is. Like, all of these names, Benjamin Franklin, FDR, Jesus, like big names that we know, you know, and I think it's because they're great storytellers. And you look at YouTube now, and I think storytelling today, like, sure, it looks a little different. It's not, you know, Benjamin Franklin sitting in his, you know, wherever he was sitting in Pennsylvania writing a letter to a newspaper. It's like, there's this YouTuber named Ryan Trahan who I love his storytelling style, and he did this penny series this summer where he's survived on one penny and for 30 days, and he delivered it across the country to like this biggest YouTuber. And it was 30 days. It came out every day, every morning at like 8 a.m. all summer. And the story was phenomenal. It was wild. And like, sure, the format has changed, but it like makes you feel things. And I think when you're a successful storyteller and you have that name recognition, now he's got like, you know, I don't even know, like 12 million followers or something on YouTube. I think he will be like a YouTuber for a generation. And when you are able to capture people through emotions and through feelings and through your passions, I think that can spread. And from a marketing standpoint, like even brands too, right? Like the most successful brands that are telling meaningful stories, like you can name them. It's the Patagonias, it's the Yetis, like you know who's doing it well. And I think when you have those great storytellers, that name recognition and that brand recognition will sort of follow, as it has through all of history.
Man, there's a lot to unpack there.
There's a lot to unpack. I know. I'm sorry. I'm so passionate about it. Clearly, I feel like I'm just like, oh, it's so interesting. I just think there's so many things we can take away from history and good storytellers.
So there's two things that you said that I wanted to circle back to. Two words. You said transported and emotion. I had never really considered the first word as I mean, now that I think about it, it makes sense. Like a good story can take you from your chair, from your couch, and put you into an entirely different world and care about someone that you have never met before, which is a pretty wild concept when you think about it, because so much of our day-to-day is physical, but storytelling has the power to transcend the physical and purely rely on your imagination and, I mean, create an entire world in your head. Like, that's why books are so fascinating to me. It's like it's all inside your head. But the second word you said was emotion, and you want to feel something. That feeling can be so nebulous sometimes, and I feel like it's something that we all want. We all want to feel something with the type of content that we've made, be it a film, picture, some artwork. But crafting that feeling and that emotion is difficult. I'm curious. So if storytelling, if the way you're defining storytelling is transporting someone in an emotional way to an emotional place, do you feel like the word story gets used appropriately in the marketing industry? Because at face value, I would say no. I feel like if that's the definition of a story, then we're using the word story wrong when we're talking about it maybe 80% of the time as an industry. I'm curious what your take is.
Yeah, I think I would probably have to agree with you. I feel like story is definitely used loosely in the marketing space. I think also just being a documentary filmmaker, I feel like I'm really, really nitpicky about my own stories. And I'm making this film right now about this group of tree climbers in Costa Rica. And they climb these big strangler figs, and it's this really wild process of how they do it. And they started this local nonprofit to help get kids into the sport and teach them about the forest through these tree climbing methods. And a process that I'm repeatedly going back to when I'm editing this is this a topic or is this a story? And I think those differences are important to understand. Like, a story has a character, a story like has something to overcome. There's like a beginning, middle, and end. A topic is like, I made a film about tree climbing in Costa Rica. That's not really a story. The story is like, there's a character there who's so passionate about tree climbing that when he started doing it as a kid without ropes, he then learned how to use these rock climbing rope systems, and having impact is such a big part of it, and overcoming the challenge of the tree wasn't enough. He's now like overcoming the difficulty of like getting other kids into it and figuring out like where the money's coming from. And all of that is the story, not just like people go tree climbing in Costa Rica. And so I think when it comes to marketing, it's a little interesting because stories can be nuanced, and telling your brand story and how that matters, sharing your values, and creating a company that I think people can empathize with. I think that's really important. In storytelling, there's an empathy component, and getting involved in the details and the feelings and the energy and the timing and the imagination and the visualization. All of that matters. But I think you're right. In the marketing industry, I feel like it can sometimes be a bit convoluted on what's a story and what's a topic, especially in commercials. They're like, we're telling the story. Like, we have time for 7 clips, They're going to look great, and the music's going to be awesome, and it's going to sell your product, but it's kind of tough to call it a story when, sure, there's a beginning, middle, and end, but there's not that character and that feeling that you're left with.
I feel like sometimes I've become kind of a jaded old man, despite not being an old, well, I feel like I'm old, but I'll see stuff pop up and they're like, oh, we told this epic story, and I'll watch it, and I just, like, I don't care. And not in the sense that like I don't care about the effort or the people that were in it, but I'm not invested in the story. I don't care about the resolution of the character or what was discussed.
Dude, I love that. I think that exactly what you just said is like a huge defining characteristic of a story too. Is like, how do you make somebody care about something that they shouldn't really care about? And all of these, like, I've been super into watching like these old now, like early 2000s, mid 2000s movies. I just watched this movie recently about, it's called The Big Year, I think, and it's with like Owen Wilson and Jack Black and Steve Martin. And it's about birding, and my girlfriend's a birder, and I've been like super into this birding thing recently because there's so many great stories of people just like going out and like finding as many species of birds in 1 year as possible. It's called The Big Year. And like doing a big year, this movie, I was like, this is so stupid. I don't want to watch a movie about birding. Like, why? I'm not a birder. I don't know. I know like the magpie. I know one bird. Why do I care about this? And like 10 minutes in, I'm like, we are not turning off this movie. This is amazing, because it made me care about something that like I shouldn't have cared about. And now I like follow all these birding accounts and I'm like getting into it because I'm like, this is so quirky and cool. Birds are cool, you know? And I think from a storytelling component, like if you can do that, if you can make people care about something, that feeling that they're left with at the end, like, I mean, me being an example of now I'm like, you know, into trying to get more into the birding community and going out and birding more because, you know, there's a story that resonated with me. So if you're a brand and you're into marketing your brand in a certain way, like what is the feeling that you want people to be left with? And if you can communicate that in a meaningful way, and we can talk about how to do that if you want, like I think that feeling that people are left with, they'll support you and they'll get more involved in your community.
So what I love there is you just I feel like gave us a peek into the curtain of the power of stories. So here you are talking about something that you had no interest in, birding, and now fast forward after watching this film, like you're hooked, you're into it. I'm thinking about that from the brand perspective of like, okay, if let's say I'm a birding company and I want to get people into birding, like this is a very big, lofty goal that me as a company I'm trying to achieve, but I'm just thinking about the different ways you could approach a goal like that. And it's what you're describing, like this film that you watched, this storytelling ultimately has gotten you hooked. It's gotten you interested in a much deeper level than maybe just like a topical video or some topical photos about birding that maybe a company could go out and produce to try to gather interest. I guess this kind of leads me to my bigger question is like, what is the power of storytelling, and why does every brand want to tell a good story?
Yeah, I think I love that. I think that question in and of itself is like exactly the question that I think brands should be asking. Because I mean, the title of this podcast, Why Stories Matter, right? And I think the stories we tell about ourselves, the stories we tell about others, the stories we tell about our own brands, like they matter, you know? Like the story I told you about at the very beginning about myself, where I'm from, what I like to do, all of those things, like people now like, oh, okay, yeah, I feel like I listen to a podcast about Roo and I feel like I know him a little bit. And that little statement of like, oh yeah, I know that brand. I kind of seen like their branding video or a lot of the things that they put out into the internet, and I like their values. I like what they're doing. That's really interesting. And I think when you go beyond the we're selling a product and you go into we're selling a lifestyle and we're selling a brand, and brands like are just like people, right? People want to know people. If I came on this podcast, you're like, tell me about yourself. And I'm like, nah, here's a cool video that I worked on. You'd be like, I don't really understand why we're here, you know? And I think with brands, if you're not willing to like be vulnerable and tell stories about yourself that, you know, even if it was a tough first couple years trying to get our product off the line, like that all goes into your story, and I think people will resonate with it and empathize with it. And I think when I look at brands that I really respect and admire, I know them similar to like I know people in my life, like Patagonia. Like we all know their values because they're continuously putting out marketing materials to showcase their values, and Yeti the same thing. And I think with me, like, I mean, I grew up like traveling all over, right? Like lived in Costa Rica, lived on Orcas Island, like spent a summer in Morocco, went to Wales for a couple of years, and like making friends in all of those different places was like a little tricky sometimes. Like I don't drink, so I couldn't go out and like bond over the high school drinking scene. And I think all of that process of like, you know, struggling to make friends as as a person that doesn't drink or do what a lot of teenagers wanted to go do in their rowdy times, like I found a really great community of friends, and I feel like over time I've been like, okay, I can make friends. And that like vulnerability, that like, okay, I know I can make friends now when I go out to events and I go to these film festivals and I can talk about my film, and I know I'm capable of like, you know, being confident in new interactions. For brands, like it's no different. You have to be vulnerable and say like, we've made mistakes, we're doing things differently. Like a lot of like the Black Diamond beacons are being recalled right now, and like that's amazing. Way to go for them for saying our product isn't up to their standards, we're going to recall it and do it again. And I think when you're allowing people to know you as a person or as a brand, and understanding like your values and your goals and your mission statement, you can begin to form a community. And when you're not telling stories about yourself, if people didn't know that like, oh, Roo doesn't drink and he had a hard time making friends, but now he has overcome that and now he's able to make friends and be confident and go out and learn from that experience and do something new, then like you can't build a community around yourself. And with brands, like I think community piece is so valuable. And stories, as we've talked about, like over history, they can form communities of people, and a community will be so receptive to what you do from a branding perspective. Like random consumers may not enjoy, you know, your product as much, but if you can build a strong community and grow that community through your values and get people aligned with what you're doing, I think those stories they can be really effective.
Is storytelling one of the only ways that brands can build community?
I don't think storytelling is the only way that brands can build community. I think there's a lot of ways that brands can build community, but I feel like it is one of the more effective ways in a digital age to build community. With videos and with photos and thoughtful captions, you can run paid ads and broadcast to a wide range of people and start to reach people that aren't necessarily in your local community. Being in Boulder, there's a lot of really cool local events that brands will do and host and support grassroots efforts and grassroots athletes doing cool things. And as like a community member, I'll go to those, and it's definitely building a community. The Patagonia store puts on all these tons of events, and like the local bike shop puts on all these cool trivia nights and events, and I love going to those, but their reach is only within Boulder County. For being in the digital age, I think storytelling is a really effective way to broaden your values and share your values, and like we were talking about, transport people into your world. And if you're in New York City and you're getting rained on and it's the middle of winter, but you want to go outdoors and you want to go climbing, when you watch a video about somebody climbing in the rain from a company that, you know, it doesn't matter what they make, but you're like, whoa, that was a cool company, I'm gonna go try that for myself. And you do it, inevitably you're out there, you need a raincoat, and you're like, oh, that was Columbia Sportswear, like I'll get a raincoat from them, you know. I think it's like those connections are important.
Yeah, that's good. The connection piece is the important part, and how you develop that connection can be done through storytelling. It can be done through in-person events, but it's developing that relationship however you can. And just due to this, you know, people are scattered, the brand can't say hi to everyone in person. So how do you reach those people? Well, currently video is the medium to do so. At least it's one of the mediums to do so.
Yeah. And I think even at the same time, like, I mean, I think I'm a little biased because I'm a filmmaker, and I think, you know, like with your video background as well, like we're both like, videos are the way to do it, you know, like what are people consuming in their free time? Like TikTok and YouTube and all of these video formats. But I think if you have a good story and it can fit in a caption, like there's no problem in doing it in another format. And I think exactly what you're doing with this podcast, like people listen to podcasts, right? Like people want to consume long form stories as well. And so when you only have long form content available, and suddenly you have a 6-second version of it, there will be people that will migrate and go do that and be like, okay, yeah, I like the process of scrolling through things and the dopamine hits and whatever. But then there are people like, I don't know, I listen to a ton of podcasts, and when I'm on runs or in the car, I just will like crank out podcasts, and I enjoy like the long form storytelling that comes with it too. So I think regardless of what it is that you're trying to accomplish as a brand, thinking through like, okay, is video the best way? If so, what type of story do we want to tell? If it's not, like maybe we start a podcast, maybe we lean more into short form content, maybe we hire a really good copywriter who can start a blog for our website. Like all of those things I think have a place. I just think at the end of the day, it comes down to emotions. And when you're communicating feelings to your audience, you can share really meaningful connections. You can create meaningful connections through that.
Yeah. Well, as you alluded to earlier, just talking about kind of the history of stories, like the medium doesn't really matter. It's what's behind the medium, whether it's oral or it's written, or it's digital. That this is just kind of the medium we're working with today, which kind of leads me to my next question. So I want to pivot a little bit and talk about the different types of stories that are out there, because we talk about story, but there's different types of stories that can be told. And you kind of alluded to this earlier when we're talking about story structure or things, or how to package a story. I'm curious if you could just like, what's your take on the different types of stories that are out there? I did look this up and I have a few examples because I can maybe only think of 2 or 3, but I found somewhere that said there were 7 types of stories out there.
Yeah, the 7 story archetypes. Oh man, this is going to be a pop quiz on if I remember all of them. But I think all of them, I mean, to step back and I think get the 30,000 foot view, because I think all of those stories are important. But I think it's the elements of story that really can like drive home why storytelling matters. And I think the 7 different story archetypes and the different formats, the different structures and templates that you can use to tell stories are really good. But I always think about when I'm telling stories, like what are the elements of a good story? And regardless of what the story archetype is and what story type you pick, I think it's the elements that like really are communicating that emotion most effectively. So
what are elements to you?
I think the elements are like, I think the first and the most enticing one is where it all starts, is like creating that anticipation. And we talked about it as like making people care when they shouldn't. Like, what are they anticipating to happen? And I think in the video format, it's most easy to talk about. This new tree climbing film that I'm editing right now, like it opens with him climbing this tree that's like sideways and jutting out from the side of this rock cliff over this river. And like 8 seconds in, he falls and the title opens and you're like, what is going to happen in this film? What just happened, you know? And so I think building anticipation, but then building that curiosity as well and keeping people hooked and wanting more, is like where it all starts. And I think from there, that's when like I really like to dive into the details. I think for rock climbing films do this so well, is like capturing the details of a story, everything from like the specific fingers on a crimp or like a foot, like, you know, on a tiny little pebble on the crag. Like, I think all of those things, like those details are so cool from a visual standpoint, but I think movies like Free Solo, they were really interesting and successful because they captured the details in a really comprehensive way, where you see Alex Honnold like talking through the specific moves in the van, and then you see him doing it up on the wall, and you know like those details matter. And when you have a great story and all of these elements, like you can create that anticipation, you can build that curiosity, but it's only when you go into the details of the actual event, the actual story of what's happening, the backstory, the specific challenge they're facing, when you really dive in, like that's where those emotions are really held. And I think we feel it when we watch movies, like the climax of the movie, like those aren't the moments where we're pulling out our phone. You know, we might be pulling out our phone to check emails or scroll through Instagram, whatever, like 8 minutes in, when they hadn't successfully hooked our curiosity or created that anticipation that is allowing us to watch farther. But once they dive into the details, I think that like that timing and the energy of those details and like the ebbs and flows of speech and volume and all of those like nuances, I think can really start to paint a picture of what's happening. And we can do that through video, through visualization. In books, we do it through imagination. But I think ultimately that all leads towards creating a feeling that your story hopefully will be told again and again and again. So when the climax hits and that like lesson is given, or that like story has come to fruition and we're seeing life afterwards, or whatever, however the story may end, like it's the anticipation, it's the curiosity, it's the details, it's painting that picture, allowing your audience to imagine and visualize, and then ultimately like conclude with the feelings. I think for me, like, I'm a very, like, I think a lot of my friends make fun of me because I'm, like, very sensitive and, like, very, like, romantic in how I view the world, and I have, like, an endless optimism about the world and the state of the world, and I think those, like, you know, those very uplifting, I mentioned earlier, like, it's the uplifting stories about hope, joy, and adventure. I'm definitely a very, like, hopeful, optimistic person. So a lot of my films tend to be about those types of feelings, but I think as a brand, whatever it is that your values are, those are my values, but for brands, if they want to showcase different values, that's the way to do it, is after you've created anticipation and the details and you've gone through the different elements, where are you trying to land? And it's where you land is how that story gets retold. Like, I'm thinking about this movie Denali, that's on Vimeo, done by Feltzel Media. It's about Ben Moon and his dog, and Ben Moon, like, gets cancer. It's, like, so touching. If you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend it to all the listeners. It's so good. I think it's, like, one of the most viewed videos on Vimeo of all time. And that story is, like, one I retell all the time. Like, he wrote a book about it, and again, transcended formats, but it's about Ben Moon, like, getting cancer, his dog being there, and then his dog getting cancer, and then his dog ultimately dying. And, like, that film, also because it's about, like, a dog dying, it just wrecks you. It's so emotional, and it's one that I think, like, gets retold again and again and again, and people watch again and again and again, because it's the feelings that come with it. It's, like, the curiosity initially of, like, oh, he's surfing, he's with his dog's sick, told from the perspective of the dog initially, so it's kind of this fun little, you know, play on the relationship. But I think where it lands is, like, so touching. And so for brands to think, what are the emotions they're trying to share, and land there, they're then in the running to have that, like, name recognition, like Patagonia, Yeti, and all the other great storytellers and storytelling brands of our generation.
Do you try to identify the emotion that you're trying to land, that you're trying to deliver to the audience at the beginning of the project? And if so, how much does it evolve as you're working through your project?
Yeah, I think for me, the emotion comes in the process of making it. For me, like, being a documentary person, I am telling real stories of real people, and I am along for their real journey. And so for me, this is a great example. I'm making this film right now about this blind skier, and I went in not being blind. I went in with this, oh, this is going to be a super cool film about her overcoming her blindness and skiing and what it's like to ski while being blind. And that's just, like, not at all what her story is. Her story is so much more about, like, she's had to overcome a lot of, like, prejudice and kind of condescending conversations. Being blind, people don't really understand how to interact with a blind person, and, like, she had some trauma in her past and had never really felt free as a kid, and now she's chasing these experiences that allow her to, like, feel really free. And the outdoors, like I said, is the backdrop for that to take place, where she's ice climbing and she's climbing and she's skiing and she's doing all that while blind, which is, sure, super cool. But the actual story is her kind of overcoming and finding that freedom. So when I started, I thought it was going to be a little bit more of, like, you know, the emotion is going to be this inspirational, touching, overcoming blindness from an outdoors perspective. But really, the emotion that is hopefully going to be communicated is more of, like, one of empathy and one of more genuine human emotions and authenticity of, she's like, I'm a normal person. I want to be invited to go ice climbing just like the rest of you. And we went ice climbing the other day, and she, like, was just totally there. Like, she was teaching me how to do stuff on the ice. Like, and I think when you look back and you take away the bias of what you're hoping to accomplish as a storyteller, like, and see what the story actually is, I think that's when the feelings and the emotions begin to land. So I would love to have an idea of what the emotion is when I go in. I think it would make the process way easier, but I think surrendering to the process and allowing those actual emotions to transpire is important. I remember when I was first starting to make documentaries, my goal was, I want to tell a story in which somebody cries in the interview, because that would be so beautiful on film, to be a part of that and capture that. And then I realized that's, like, not up to my control at all, and, like, super selfish of me to want, you know? And then inevitably, like, over time, when you're asking people about their deepest, darkest secrets on film, and they open up, like, sometimes tears will come, but it shouldn't be my intention as a filmmaker to make people cry.
You make a good point how you kind of discover it as you go. And it's kind of like this building the airplane while you're flying it situation, which is kind of nerve-wracking sometimes, especially when clients involved and you're trying to like paint a vision for them and assure them that it's all going to come out all right. But at the same time, like you kind of do just have to respect the process. Just like your character has gone through a process, the filmmaking process in itself is its own process.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, the same with you in this podcast, right? Is like, you can go in with as much of a plan as you want, but ultimately it's like what the guest is going to say and how you respond to that is like where the podcast beauty comes from, and like why people sometimes are left with at the end of the podcast being like, man, the Backcountry Marketing Podcast, Cole's a great interviewer, you know, which you are, you totally are. And I think people want to listen to people that ask meaningful questions and can tell meaningful stories because, like I said, the emotion that lands or the information that's provided. And I think, sure, sometimes it is about emotion, but I think there's a place as well for other types of stories where it's communicating an issue or communicating information that deserves to be, like, to transport the audience into this informational story too. I just think the ones that stick and the ones that last are, and the ones that deserve to be retold are all emotional in their essence.
Do you think, all right, I'm getting kind of lofty with my ideas here, but I'm just thinking about the this might sound really naive, but I'm thinking about like the problems of the world today. And I have this thought of like, could you solve all of the problems with an extremely well done story where you got the right people to watch it? Could you solve big problems?
Dude, I love that. I love that question. And it actually brings me back to when I was in college. I was in the Politics of Middle East and North Africa class. And our professor gave us this assignment. And he said, you have 24 hours to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Come back tomorrow with a solution. Just do it. And we're like, oh, what? We're like a bunch of, like white college kids. I went to like a liberal arts school in Colorado. And we're like, okay. And man, after like 23 and a half hours, we're all like pulling our hair out, like there's no solution, And, this was all of our like senior year. We'd all like written a thesis about something in the Middle East. We'd all like done a lot of research into this area. And we came back, we're like, we don't know, And I think storytelling, like, I think there's a lot of power in it. And I think there's ways to share information and share emotion and provide a lot of insight and value to the world through storytelling. But I think the same way that I tell some of my clients, like, you can't eat stories for breakfast, like I kind of need money too to buy food and eat food. I think there's a place for all of it. And I remember similar in college, I was taking an art class where a similar big lofty question was asked of, is art useless? And that was just this whole, the week-long discussion about, is art useful or not? And somebody said the same thing. They're like, well, you can't eat art for breakfast and you got to have food, And I think storytelling, like, albeit really powerful and really transcendent and can have a lot of lasting impacts, I think there's space for other conversations to be had. And I think ultimately my hope is with storytelling. And like I mentioned with sharing my film festival experience recently with Kevin Wilson, the paralyzed skier, like, I think ultimately if stories can wrap up and they can end and more conversations can come from them, then I think they're serving well. So I think maybe no, storytelling won't solve the world's problems, but I think yes, that storytelling hopefully can start a conversation that can solve those world problems.
I think about something like propaganda, like it's this massive machine that can be deployed either for good or for bad. But all it is it's just a bunch of smart people who understand how a population works. They understand what motivates them. And then you just pull levers and you put certain messaging here, and maybe you give a nudge here. And ultimately you start to push people towards a direction that you want them to go. So like, it feels like it has, as you said, if you could start the conversation, if you can like get the ball rolling, hopefully good things could come from it.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, you see it with like a lot of like US propaganda in Southeast Asia, or like Southeast Asian propaganda, like within North Korea. It's like when we're dropping flyers about democracy in the West, like it's not the poster that, changes the world. It's the conversations that happen afterwards that potentially can. And I think having worked in diplomacy for a little while, that's what I found really interesting, because working in that world, like, people aren't actively thinking, hey, what are the stories we tell ourselves? What is the story of the United States government working in the Middle East? But I think, like, the rest of the world is asking those questions, And I think when you can kind of take the step farther back of like, oh man, here's this wild story of how we found Saddam Hussein, or this is, movies have been made about a lot of these sorts of like things that happened in the Libyan embassy, and when you can take those stories and wrap them up, and whether it wraps up with like a nice little bow or with the box everywhere and chocolate sprayed all over the floor, regardless of how it ends, it's like once the end credits roll, it's the conversations afterwards that I think matter. And I remember when I forget what the name of that movie was about the Libyan embassy with like John Krasinski, and he plays this soldier. Regardless of what it was,
I couldn't tell. I've seen it. I don't know what.
Yeah, it was like I don't remember, but I remember after that film, I watched it and like talked about it for many days, because I was like, this is really interesting, and there's a lot of lessons that we can take from this, because it was about the time that I was working in government, and I was like, there's a lot of lessons we can take from this. They're like, yeah, we know it happened already, like we already learned all those lessons. I was like, oh right, like I'm not revolutionary, but I think it's like the ongoing conversation, like it's a great story, deserves to be retold, deserves to be revisited. And I think when you have a lesson like that, how do you learn from it? And I think with brands too, like I'm going through the process right now where I'm trying to, like, I think short form content is like something that I think a lot of people should be getting involved in. And I am not super familiar with it from like a creation standpoint. So this month I set like a 30 YouTube shorts in 30 days challenge for myself. So when brands ask me in the future, like, hey, can you make short form content? I'm like, yes. And I think I understand a little bit of how it works. Like, I'm not going to be an expert, but I've done it for myself for a month. So I think I kind of get the gist of it. And learning how to tell a story in like 30 seconds is really hard. And like going through that process has, I think, taught me a lot about like the fundamental elements of storytelling. And when that video is done and you're swiping to the next one, like audience retention is so huge that if you're not continuously capturing their attention, people are just going to swipe away. And that's where I think the age of storytelling now is like both really exciting, but also really scary. It's like, oh, there's a good story. Like we're creating that anticipation, but the details aren't going to come. Act 2 isn't going to come for another 10 minutes. So just stick around. Like that doesn't happen on short form content. You got to like boom, 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 get it like right back to back to back to back. And I think with brands and for marketing purposes, like I think brands are actually at a luxury of having a long window in which it's like not the length of 2 hours. It's they can create a brand story over the course of a year. Like what they decide to share on LinkedIn and what they decide to post on their social media feed. Like after a year, people can scroll through 80 posts and see like, this is who the brand is, which I think is actually really exciting. And it can validate those points and create moments of tension and resolution, but over the course of a long period of time, which I think is really exciting from a branding perspective.
You said this shorts exercise is helping you develop the fundamentals to story. How do you define those?
I think having a clear beginning, middle, and end. I think having a moment of tension and having a moment of resolution is like very basic. You can do it in 6 seconds. It's really hard, and you gotta delete a lot of things. But I think, I mean, I'm 9 days in, so I'm not a shorts expert by any means, but I feel like that's kind of what's working, as I'm seeing like my audience retention go up a little bit each video. I think it's interesting to really ask those questions. But I mean, who knows? That's why I'm excited about this challenge, is in 20 days, I may walk away with like, okay, yes, I think creating anticipation and curiosity initially is really good, but I think you don't really need to go into the details. I think the resolution just has to come because it's a short form piece and people just want it quick. So who knows, right? I think things may change, but it's giving me an opportunity to reflect on storytelling and what works in this new format. And I love to write, and I love to write songs, and I think all of those things still, like, I do this kind of often, and I think it's kind of cheesy, but I'll drive out into the mountains somewhere, and I'll sit in the back of my car, and I won't, because I have like a Subaru Forester, and I can like sit in there, and so I'll sit with my guitar, and I'll like write a song in the back of my car. And I think that process of just like removing every sort of distraction and thinking, okay, like I have words to communicate emotion. How do I do that? I think that actually anticipates like a lot of challenges that'll come up with as a filmmaker, where I can't find the words in the interview and I don't quite know what emotion I want. I think with songwriting, it's the same creative process. And I think the process of discovering the story as you're writing it is part of the beauty. And I think with brands, Patagonia didn't go in however many years ago being like, this is exactly what we're gonna do for all time, you know? Like, they had to learn as well, from like building pitons to now creating what they've created, you know, basically a glorified nonprofit that sells coats. So I think they discovered their brand story over many years. And I think the same way that like I'll sit in the back of my car with like an empty notes app and have to figure out the words by the end of the song, like brands have to do the same process, and it's okay to not know right away. It's like the process of doing it that allows you the opportunity to get better at it. And I know like a lot of storytellers and filmmakers and photographers, like they want to be really great storytellers today. And like we do too, right? Like there's a reason you're like starting this podcast and asking people about marketing. Is like you want to know now like what it is to be successful in this industry, like what it is to learn more and to grow and be inspired. But I think it's the process of doing it over many years that allows you to thrive. And we were talking about, like, before this podcast began, it's if you're looking at all of the most famous Hollywood directors, they're all like 60. They're all older and have many years experience of doing what they do in order to understand like the nuances of how to capture a meaningful story. And I think brands that are just starting out, like, this is your opportunity to get started in that process. So 10 years down the line, like, you may be the rivaling Patagonia and Yeti, but you also, you know, may not be. And it's okay to take another 10 years and figure it out. Just continue to like learn and grow and ask yourself these questions and be consuming media like the Backcountry Marketing Podcast in order to to learn more and grow in the field, for sure.
Yeah. Well, Roo, we're coming up on the end of our time for today. I feel like you're already kind of wrapping this up for us, putting a bow on it. We've reached Act 3. Credits are about to roll, but sum it up for us. What should we take away? Storytelling is an incredible tool. It has an incredible responsibility that comes along with it, but it takes a lot of work to deploy it and to use it well. For folks that are listening who are trying to get started in this creative storytelling process, you know, we've got some other episodes coming out the following weeks to help kind of continue this conversation. But if you had to wrap up, you know, your perspective on storytelling, Roo, how would you end it?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think one I'll continue to ask, hopefully myself, over the next many years. But I think if I were to leave the audience with one lasting piece of wisdom, maybe, is that storytelling matters, and that in order to tell meaningful stories and tell those stories that matter, especially in the backcountry marketing industry, like, don't be afraid to use your products as the backdrop for letting these sorts of stories unfold. Like, every great story has an exposition. It starts somewhere. Every great play has a stage. Use your products like as a stage. Use the outdoors as your amphitheater to let these stories unfold. And don't be afraid to like be vulnerable and allow filmmakers, photographers, your company to show weaknesses and say, we are learning as we go, and we are excited about, you know, these values and these emotions that we can share with our audiences. But I think if you let your products kind of take a backseat role to these more human emotions, you can let those human emotions thrive. You can start to build a community. You can inspire. You can persuade. You can launch a movement. You can tap into people's potential, and you can show your community that there are meaningful stories and meaningful values that you as a company can stand for. And when your products are there, sure, they may buy the product, but even more so, they'll be brand loyal, and they'll talk about you to their friends. And there's no amount of paid ads that have the same emotional impact as a story that can be retold. If you watch any sort of media from a brand and you tell your friend and your friend tells me, suddenly we have 3 people that are then excited about this one brand and the stories that you're telling. So I think for a brand to be aware of the storytelling potential, both the stories they tell themselves, the stories they tell about themselves, including, we're a good company, we're making it, we're good, we're going through challenges, but we'll stick it out and it's going to be fine. Those stories that you tell yourselves matter, in addition to the stories you tell others, for sure.
Beautiful. Roo, if folks want to follow along with you, if they want to get to know you, where can they find you?
Yeah, I write a lot on my website. I have a blog on roosmith.com, roosmith.com. My Instagram is roosmith6. And feel free to watch some kind of cringy shorts on my YouTube channel. I'm just Roo Smith on YouTube. Learning as I'm going, but like and subscribe, as they say, or whatever.
Awesome. Well, Roo, thank you again. This has been a really fun conversation. Thank you for kicking off this conversation all about storytelling. Folks, I'd encourage you to tune into next week's episode. We're going to be talking about how to use data and analytics to make more educated decisions and have an understanding about your audience. Because as we kind of alluded to, your audience is key when it comes to crafting a story. And you want to be crafting stories for an audience, not just throwing something out there into the universe and hoping that people find it. Although sometimes that works. But Roo, thank you again for taking the time and sharing with us some of your thoughts. I wish you the best of luck, and I'm excited to watch some of your films. Sounds like you got some cool stuff in the works.
Thanks so much, Cole. Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. Have a good rest of your day.
Take care. See ya.
Bye.